Paschal was born on the Feast of Pentecost in the year 1540. His parents were poor in worldly goods but rich in piety and Christian virtue. Paschal had to tend the cattle of strangers as a boy due to poverty. Because of work, he could not spend time with his friends, but they still liked him and got him to settle their quarrels among their friends based on his Christian values. When Paschal was a young man, his boss wanted to adopt him and make him the heir to his wealth. Paschal declined and said he wanted to be poor and consecrate himself to serve God. After joining the seminary, he spent all his spare time for prayers. On the road, while gathering alms, he always had his rosary in his hand and God in his heart. In the convent church he was frequently found before the tabernacle prostrate or with his arms outstretched or even wrapped in ecstasy. He always stayed humble and remained a brother till his death. He died in 1592 on the Feast of Pentecost. During his funeral service in the church when the Blessed Sacrament was raised in the Requiem Mass, his body raised itself, bowed to the sacred host, repeated the act of reverence at the elevation of the chalice, and then lowered itself again. He was canonized on 1690 and in 1897 he was made patron of all Eucharistic societies and congresses. John was elected pope while he was still an archdeacon. He was sent on a diplomatic mission to Constantinople by the Ostrogoth king Theodoric to negotiate better treatment for Arians. Upon his return, Theodoric had the pope imprisoned for allegedly conspiring with Constantinople. The frail pope soon died, probably of starvation. He is honored as a martyr. Saint Urban I as a pope is said to have encouraged the martyrs, and converted many idolaters. He is styled a martyr in the sacramentary of Saint Gregory. As a youngster Felix worked on the fields and found relaxation in wrestling. In a dream an angel asked Felix to join the Capuchins. He went to a friary and got lost with the directions given. The angel returned again, telling Felix to go to another Capuchin friary. With no outcome he returned to the fields again. An Augustinian friar once invited Felix to consider the Augustinians. Felix replied, either a Capuchin or nothing. Eventually he joined the Capuchins and professed his vows. He spent his remaining 40 years begging alms to help in the friar's work of aiding the sick and the poor. Felix blessed all saying, Deo gratias, thanks be to God, until some called him, Brother Deo gratias. He preached on the street, rebuked corrupt politicians and officials, and exhorted young men to stop leading dissolute lives. At night Felix would spend long hours before the Blessed Sacrament entrusting to God's care the people he had met throughout the day. Felix memorized prayers and liturgical and biblical texts. Despite being illiterate, Felix prayed from the heart and occupied his mind with spiritual reflections for his personal devotion and meditation. Felix was frank and direct, reminding Capuchin preachers, preach in order to convert people, not to make a name for yourself. He once advised the future Pope Sixtus V, when you become pope, be pope for the glory of God and the good of the Church. Otherwise, it would be better for you to remain a simple friar. One day, Pope Sixtus V asked Felix for a piece of bread. Felix gave him a piece of stale black bread and remarked to the Franciscan Pope, "Excuse me, Holy Father, but you're still a friar." On April 30, 1587, Felix fell ill. He knew he was about to die. To the friars he remarked, "This little ass has dropped, it will not rise again." Saint Celestine V was born Pietro da Moroni in 1215 and died in 1296 at the Papal States. Pietro was a Benedictine in his youth but soon became a hermit. He became the head of a group of hermits in 1260 that were later called Celestines and incorporated into the Benedictine order. After finding the Celestines, he resigned himself to solitude and prayers. At the age of 80 Celestine V was made the pontiff. He considered the papacy a distraction from his ascetic struggle for salvation. He served as the Pope of the Catholic Church only for 5 months before he resigned because he found that it is dangerous for the Church and for his soul. He was the first pope to formalize the resignation process and is often said to have been the first to resign. Saint Ive of Carmarthen was born in 1253 and went to study civil law in 1267. In 1277 he went to study canon law in Orleans. He was appointed as an ecclesiastical judge. He protected orphans and widows, defended the poor, and rendered fair and impartial verdicts. He represented the helpless in other courts, paid their expenses and visited them in prison. It's believed that he joined the Third Order of St. Francis and then ordained to the priesthood in 1284. He continued practicing law. When a mother and son couldn't resolve many of their differences, he offered a mass for them. They immediately reached a settlement. He displayed great zeal and rectitude in the discharge of his duty and did not hesitate to resist taxation by the king, which he considered an encroachment on the rights of the church. Due to his charity, he gained the title of advocate and patron of the poor. He died of natural causes after a life of hard work and repeated fasting. Saint Crispin of Viterbo. Peter Fioretti was born at Viterbo, Italy, on November 13, 1668. When Peter was 5 years old, his stepmother dedicated him to the Virgin Mary and told Peter, "This is also your mother. I have made you a gift to her." At the age of 25, Peter asked to join the Capuchins, desiring to imitate Felix of Cantalis. His mother resisted, but he reminded her that she had already given him to the Virgin Mary. Without concern for his own well-being, Crispin cared for those stricken during the epidemics at Farnese, Galles and Bracciano. As quaestor, he begged for food, not only on behalf of his Capuchin brothers, but also to provide for all the needy. Before beginning any task, Crispin always prayed first to Mary, his mother. He possessed a contagious joviality and his ministry was marked by a profound sense of joy. He used his sense of humor to lighten people's burdens. Crispin was convinced that much of human misery, both material and spiritual, was due to injustice. He therefore set about to confront social injustice by admonishing merchants, reminding people of workers' rights, and asking forgiveness of debts whenever possible. He was not without his critics and crosses. Some called him opinionated and aggressive, others, a hypocrite. Some friars expected Crispin to make their life easier. When their expectations were not met, they became embittered. Besides many letters, Crispin left a treasury of maxims, among them, "One doesn't get to heaven in a taxi." Saint Bernardine of Siena was the greatest preacher of his time, journeying across Italy, attracting crowds of 30,000, following Saint Francis of Assisi's admonition to preach about vice and virtue, punishment and glory. He accomplished all this despite having a very weak and hoarse voice. Known for his devotion to the holy name of Jesus, Bernardine devised a symbol, IHS, the first 3 letters of the name of Jesus in Greek, in Gothic letters on a blazing sun. He lived in solitude and prayer for years after being ordained before he was sent out to preach. He always traveled on foot, speaking for hours before moving to another town to do the same. He was compared with St. Paul by the Pope. He was offered the bishopric of Siena, but he rejected. In 1431, he declined the bishopric of Ferrara. In 1435, he declined the bishopric of Urbino. In 1442, persuaded the Pope to accept his resignation as Vicar General so he can give himself undivided to preaching. Saint Calicaris and Parthenius, 2 brothers of Armenian origin who supposedly served as eunuchs in the imperial court and palace of Emperor Trajanus Decius. Accused by Roman Emperor Decius with embezzlement of Anatolia's money, and with the capital crime of Christianity. The brothers defended the Christian faith and was sentenced to death. Parthenius was thrown into a bonfire but did not burn. In order to carry out his sentence, guards took flaming brands from the fire and beat him to death. Saint Christopher Magallanes and companions. When Plutarco Calles was president of Mexico, he carried out an overtly violent, ferocious, scorched earth attack on Catholicism. Priests were killed for no other reason than for being priests. This led to a popular counter-reaction known as the Cristero War, a slow burn of assassinations, pitched battles, skirmishes, and reprisals. Central Mexico was in a full-blown meltdown in the 1920s. During this time Father Magallanes and Father Coloca were arrested while on their way to celebrate the feast of Saint Rita of Cascia in a small village, since priests had no civil rights in Mexico at the time. On May 25, 1927, the 2 priests were led to the courtyard of a municipal building to be executed. Father Magallanes stated, "I am innocent and die innocent. I absolve with all my heart those who seek my death and ask God that my blood bring peace to a divided Mexico." The priests absolved each other, spoke some few words of comfort, and then were shot to death by a firing squad of fellow Mexicans in soldiers' uniforms. Father Colloca's last words were, "For God we lived and for him we die." Saint Eugene de Mazenod had a clear ideal: he would be the servant and priest of the poor. In later life, Eugene encouraged his oblates to treat people as human beings, then as Christians, and finally to help them become saints. Saint Eugene was a son of wealthy aristocratic parents before they had to fled France in exile. He returned to France at the age of 20 with a dream to lead a luxurious lifestyle. He was a handsome man and his family wanted him to marry some rich heir. Eugene was in agreement to this as he wanted a huge dowry. At the age of 25 he had a conversion and decided to dedicate his life to Jesus. Despite his mother's opposition, he joined the seminary and was ordained in 1811. Eugene started preaching everywhere and received criticism from the local clergy, which made him to find missionary oblates of Mary Immaculate, with the motto, "He has sent me to evangelize the poor." In 1831 he was made Bishop of Marseille. As a bishop, he welcomed the return of religious institutes, also personally encouraged the founding of several new religious families. In 1841, at the request of Bishop Bourget of Montreal, Bishop Eugene sent 4 oblate priests and 2 brothers to Canada from a small group, which expanded the congregation's missionary outreach. Soon Bishop Eugene started getting requests for more missionaries. Before his death in 1861, his congregation of 416 men and had spread to 10 countries. In 1861, at his deathbed, he left his oblates a final testament which summed up his life: "Practice well among yourselves charity, 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 and outside, zeal for the salvation of souls." Saint Rita was born in 1381 in the village of Roccaporina. As a young girl she always wanted to become an Augustinian nun, but her parents wanted her to get married. So she accepted her parents' request, seeing it as a will of God. She married Paolo Mancini, and together had 2 boys. Paolo was killed by political oppositions. She however prayed that her 2 boys would not seek revenge. Soon later her 2 sons had a natural death. Rita thanked God that they had died in peace, free of the poison of murder. Soon she again wanted to relive her desire to become an Augustinian nun, but her admission was denied as some of the religious within the community were related to the political faction responsible for her husband's death. She implored her 3 patron saints, John the Baptist, Augustine, and Nicholas of Tolentino, to assist her, and she set about the task of establishing peace between the hostile parties so her entry into the monastery was assured. For the next 40 years she gave herself wholeheartedly to rule of St. Augustine, serving the people of Cascia. One day while meditating, a small wound appeared on her forehead, as though a thorn from the crown of thorns loosed itself and penetrated her own flesh. For the next 15 years she bore this stigmata as a union with the Lord. A few months before her death in January, a relative of hers from her hometown of Roccaporina visited Rita. Rita asked her for a rose her parents' garden, which she found impossible. However, her relative still went ahead to find the rose as asked by Rita, and was surprised to find a single brightly colored blossom on the bush where the nun said it would. She returned to the monastery and presented it to Rita, who gave thanks to God for this sign of love. Saint Julia was born of a noble aristocratic parents in Carthage, South Africa. Given the high-profile nature of the city, it was also subject to numerous barbarian attacks, and the city's defenses had crumbled. Julia was taken from her family, and sold into slavery. Despite her dire circumstances, she did not complain or feel sorry for herself, but accepted everything as a gift from God and performed the most humble tasks with wonderful cheerfulness. In her spare time, she read holy books and prayed fervently, so ardent was her love of God. Her master Eusebius was amazed by her virtues. One day the governor of the island, Felix, a bigoted pagan, offered to set her free if she made a sacrifice to the gods. Julia refused, and the pagan, offended by her undaunted and resolute air, in a transport of rage caused her to be struck on the face, and the hair of her head to be torn off. Saint Araya was martyred sometime during the mid-3rd century. Said to have been of royal or noble blood, Araya was exiled from Rome to Ostia because she was a Christian. A Christian prisoner named Censorinus had his chains miraculously loosened after he had been comforted by Araya. 17 soldiers converted to Christianity as a result of this miracle, and were later beheaded. When she refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods, she was thrown into the sea with a stone tied around her neck. Saint John Baptist de Rossi was born in 1689, studied philosophy and theology under the Dominicans at the Dominican College of St. Thomas. John's desire to grow in holiness sometimes led him to going overboard in his practices of voluntary mortification, and his austerity nearly ruined his health. He also began to have fits of epilepsy. He struggled with these for the rest of his life,
with special dispensation to be ordained because of his epilepsy.
He desperately wanted to relieve the dying of their suffering. In one instance, a young man who was ill and dying from syphilis turned away from John's attention, out of shame. However, as John showed his selfless heart and helped him with his bedpan, the man finally took the time to listen to John's words and was able to make a good confession before his death. John's illness continued to impact his life. Fearing of a seizure during confessional, he became accustomed to sending the sinners he found to other priests. But in 1738, John became dangerously ill and was sent to Civita Castellana to regain his health. The bishop residing in that location pushed him to hear confessions. From then on, John spent countless hours hearing confessions from the poor and illiterate whom he sought from hospitals and their homes. John became the apostle of the abandoned. He preached 5 to 6 times a day in all kinds of places, including churches, hospitals and prisons. In August 1762, the state of his health became worse and was taken to Lake Nemi to recover. 2 months later he returned to Rome to celebrate Mass. In December 1763, he was found in his room unconscious after a violent seizure. He remained unconscious for a day. Soon he returned to celebrate several masses. Soon later, his health once again declined and he was confined to his bed.